Welcome back to the Ozark podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Veet, joined as always by co-host of the show and my good buddy, Kyle Plunkett.
Yes, sir.
How's it going, brother?
Going good. We got something special today. I'm looking forward to it. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. So, what are we up to?
Today is the launch of our brand new show with Dr. Brooks Blevins, and that is the Old Ozarks. We could not be more excited. This has been something that's been kind of in the hopper for the last, since we interviewed Brooks 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking about how can we collaborate. And so we teased it about a month or two ago with Dr. Blevins coming on the show, talking about what we're going to be covering. And that's the history of the Ozarks. Like his first book is called The Old Ozarks. We're kind of taking that name and running with it. And I think it's important. You know, you might sit there and ask, like, why is a hunting and fishing and conservation show going to be talking about history? Like, how do those things play into each other? And I think it's actually the more that we've done this podcast, I think the more that reason has become clear to me.
Oh,
at
for
least,
sure.
right?
Well, the connection to place and heritage and culture and tradition and all of that is, all of that is rooted in what we love to do here and now and today, and the current Ozarks, the modern Ozarks, and wanting to cover kind of more of the backstory as to why we love to hunt and fish and why we care about conservation and the natural landscape and connectedness to place and all that kind of stuff is rooted in our history. And we also realized pretty quickly that we are not the history experts.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than trying to be the history experts, we're bringing on the history expert,
the guy,
to do the show for us.
Yeah, I totally agree that it's all connected, as we've uncovered many times, again and again and again throughout all of the episodes we've done. And we're going to be learning from Dr. Blevins and letting him take the lead. This is his show. He's running it on our feed, but we're excited to partner with him. And, our goal is to deepen our connection to the land and the stories that, took place here, and also continue to foster and steward the place that we love, the resources, and protect our history, protect our heritage, and the things that we have that are unique to the Ozarks. And so that's what this show is about. And Dr. Blevins is going to be taking it. And we think he's done a really, really good job with just the first couple of episodes that we've heard so far. And so I'm really, really excited to officially launch Dr. Brooks Blevins, the Old Ozarks.
Hey, I'm Brooks Blevins, and this is the Old Ozarks, a weekly peek into the bygone days of the hill country I call home. These are the real stories of the people and places of this American region we call the Ozarks. We're not as simple as you might think, but just as colorful as you might imagine. Glad to have you. Now let's haul off and go to it. Each week there will be two parts to this thing. One I call the short sweetening, and the other the long sweetening. You might wonder where those phrases come from. Well, I'll tell you. A few decades back, it would have been common for an Ozark dinner table to hold at least two sweeteners. Short sweetening was a term used for sugar, plain old store-bought and cane sugar. Long sweetening? That was sorghum, or sorghum as many of the old-timers pronounced it. And in the rural Ozarks, it was produced locally and communally for more than a century. In late summer or early fall, you can still find a sorghum cooking or two here in the 21st century, but they're nowhere near as common as they once were. An old-timer asked me the other day, if sugar is short sweetening and sorghum is long sweetening, what's honey? I didn't have an answer. I don't reckon I've ever heard an Ozark slang term for honey. We could call it bee sweetening, I suppose, and see if that catches on. But maybe honey is just honey, perfect the way it is and the way it sounds. So the short sweetening each week will be the briefer of the two segments, and it'll be a quick lesson on how to talk Ozark. Sometimes it'll be an unusual word, sometimes a peculiar pronunciation. Every once in a while it'll be something about grammar, what speakers of standard English call bad grammar, but what we might call just plain old talking. What we learn in the short sweetening will always be something that you might hear or could have heard a few years ago, somewhere out in the rural Ozarks, in our sister region Appalachia, or in the South in general. In case you didn't notice, we've done covered our first short sweetening. Now you know what short sweetening and long sweetening were on the kitchen table. As for the Old Ozarks long sweetening, that'll be the main story each week. We'll tear into something about the history of this place we call the Ozarks. It might be an interesting person from our past. History is, after all, about people. Sometimes it'll be an event or a place or even a concept. In other words, it'll be the main story of the week. For this inaugural long sweetening, we're going to start with the most basic of topics in Ozark history, that odd old word itself. What about this word, Ozark? Where does it come from, and how in the dickens did it catch on? I'm sure a few of you have tried to trace the history, or etymology, as linguistic scholars call it, of that funny word Ozark. I have too. Here in the 21st century, what that almost always means is we Googled it. An internet search may lead you to the correct answer. Then again, it's just as likely to lead you to one of the alternative versions of this backstory, versions that are almost certainly wrong. There's a popular wrong version that claims the word Ozark is a corruption of the word Bodark, which is a regional term, not to mention a mispronunciation, of the little shrubby, thorny tree that most of the rest of the country calls an Osage orange or a hedge apple. They were and are Bodarks on the Blevins farm, and my grandpa and dad declared war on them with such determination that I'm surprised a few of the magnificent yeller-wooded trees outlived those two old-timers. I wish the Bodark story were true, but it ain't, and neither are the more far-fetched explanations. One tries to make the case that Ozark is derived from some French term for bend in the river. Another goes all scientific and wants us to believe that Ozark is a corruption of a French translation of a German geological treatise that used the term Ozoic, which refers to the period of the Earth's story that predated life. I can promise you the real story isn't that complex, but like any road in the Ozarks, it's a story with a few curves. So grab hold and listen good. We'll start at the beginning. Not the beginning, but about as far back there as we can go in the written record of this neck of the woods. We'll go way back to the late 1600s. That's when French explorers in Canada discovered the upper Mississippi River, and eventually followed it all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. The French established their first trading post in 1686, a few miles up the Arkansas River near a native village. But here's the first curve in our story. The French didn't call those natives what we call them today, the Quapaw, or even what the indigenous people called themselves, something closer to Ogapa. Instead, the French borrowed the Illini name for this tribe. The Illini refer to these folks inhabiting the swampy bottoms of the lower Arkansas and White Rivers as the people of the South Wind. And to the French, the Illini word for people of the South Wind sounded something like Arkansas. Today, historians call this first European settlement in the Mississippi Valley Arkansas Post. But the French developed another name for their post, calling the little settlement Oz, Arkansas, spelled A-U-X, Arkansas, meaning at the home of the Arkansas. They eventually abbreviated it to Ozark, or Ozarks. When the British made their way overland to the Mississippi a few years before the American Revolution and established their own trading post on the east side of the river, they adopted the French pronunciation but put an English spin on the spelling. The British post thus became O-Z-A-R-K, Ozark, and that is, of course, the spelling that survives to this day. By the time the United States took possession of the western side of the Mississippi River drainage with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the words Ozark and Arkansas were often used interchangeably. In fact, the earliest references to the word Ozark in American newspapers and books were not about hills or mountains. They were about a river and a village. What we now call the Arkansas River and what historians call Arkansas Post were sometimes called the Ozark River and the settlement of Ozark. I've even seen an early 19th century mention of the Ozark District, which referred to the vast Arkansas River watershed west of what was then the Arkansas Territory. So, why is the swampy flat country near the mouth of the Arkansas River, the ancestral home of the Quapaw, not called the Ozarks anymore? Why isn't the Arkansas River Valley the Ozark River Valley? Well, it's not entirely clear. But here's what happened, I think. The word Ozark undoubtedly made its way up the river we now call the Arkansas, and probably up the White River too, well before the U.S. laid claim to the Louisiana Purchase. And somewhere up those rivers is where the label would stick before too long. The journeys of Lewis and Clark and Zebulon Pike stirred the public's curiosity over the new Louisiana Purchase. But the War of 1812, a sort of second war of American independence against England, slowed exploration and mapping of the vast interior of North America. Those efforts resumed after the war ended, when the government organized an ambitious trip up the Missouri River and into the Yellowstone Valley. That expedition fizzled out before it got good and started, but the chief Army engineer and cartographer on that project was reassigned another task: exploring and mapping the Platte, Arkansas, and Red Rivers. Major Stephen Harriman Long, a young New Hampshire native, made it to the Rocky Mountains with his team of scientists, artists, and hunters in 1820 and came back down the Arkansas River. 2 years later, Major Long published his map of this vast drainage area. Long's map was considered a great improvement over earlier maps of the West, and the Major inadvertently contributed to bubbling geopolitical divisions within the nation when he labeled the treeless expanse we know as the Great Plains the Great Desert and warned American settlers not to move there. But for our purposes, Long's most significant contribution was another label he affixed to his map: Ozark Mountains. It was the first time an American map used the word Ozark for something other than a river or a little village in the swamps. And some region it was. Long placed the O on Ozark just south of the Red River in northeastern Texas. The S on mountains rested not far from St. Louis. Shading outlined the roughly parallelogram shape of the highland region, drifting from southwest to northeast. There is some evidence that other names had been used for this geographic feature that scholars today call the interior highlands. I've come across the terms Black Mountains and Massern Mountains, but Long's use of Ozark Mountain stuck, and these hills finally had a permanent name in 1822. This big Ozarks would be the norm for the remainder of the 19th century. It included the place we recognize today as the Ozark Plateau, but it also included the region we now call the Ouachita Mountains. The Big Ozarks contained more than 60,000 square miles, larger than the whole state of Georgia. As the 19th century wore on, the name Ozark grew in popularity, and you have to admit there is something aesthetically pleasing about the visual appearance of the word, and the sound of it too. Ozark. It's purely and peculiarly American, cobbled together in the middle of the continent with contributions from multiple languages, settlers, and natives. In 1834, when Congress established the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, early newspaper accounts sometimes referred to it as the Ozark Territory. 2 years later, future Arkansas Governor Archibald Yale and a couple of his prominent friends began selling lots in the new town of Ozark, platted on the north bank of the Arkansas River. Residents about 15 miles south of Springfield, Missouri, followed suit 5 years later. Eventually, the novelty of the name, or maybe its unique sound, would coax townspeople as far away as Alabama and Michigan to change the name of their villages to Ozark. In 1837, just before Christmas, Captain Hosey and his crew left Cincinnati on a brand new steamboat called the Ozark. It was a fitting replacement for the Arkansas, which sank earlier that year. And by the way, that's Arkansas with a W on the end of it, just like the good Lord intended. The Ozark made its regular run between New Orleans and Little Rock and occasionally went as far up the Arkansas River as Fort Gibson Indian Territory. During the Civil War, the Union Navy christened one of its Mississippi River gunboats the USS Ozark. It was the first of 3 Navy boats so named. Around the turn of the 20th century, the Navy commissioned a seagoing monitor as the USS Arkansas and renamed it the USS Ozark a few years later. Funny how the namers of boats seem to sense the connection between Arkansas and Ozark. The last Navy vessel to carry the name USS Ozark was a World War II vehicle landing ship. But enough about boats in this landlocked region. Back to the hills we go. For when we last visited the Ozarks, it occupied a lot more space on the map than it does today. How do we account for that? If Stephen Harriman Long put the Ozarks on the map, literally, it was another scientific expedition that cemented the idea of the Big Ozarks. That expedition was carried out by a British geologist in 1834. In the annals of confusing pronunciations, and there are a bushel of those in the Ozark dialect, this feller's name takes the cake. In Arkansas, he's called George Fanshawe, but that efficiency seems an injustice to a last name that is 16 letters long and looks like it should be pronounced Featherston Hall. That's right, somehow we reduced and twisted Featherston Hall to Fanshawe, a modern marvel of linguistic efficiency. The Google machine reveals about half a dozen other potential pronunciations: Fearston Hall, Feaston Hay, Featherston without the hall, but no one recommends pronouncing the name in its entirety and exactly the way it looks like it ought to be pronounced. With that kind of disregard for the rules of the English language, the Feaston Hays or the Fanshaws or whoever old George's people were would have fit right in where I grew up. But by his own account, the persnickety Brit didn't fit in anywhere he went in the Big Ozarks in 1834. In the published book of his journey through Missouri and Arkansas, George Fanshawe constantly complained about the putrid food and subpar lodgings he endured and the ragged, no-account kinds of humans he encountered. Still, that published description spread far and wide the idea that the entire hill country between the Missouri and Red Rivers was one big Ozarks, and so it would remain for another lifetime. I'm not sure when the east-west running ridges south of the Arkansas River first began to be referred to as the Washitaws, but the name itself is derived from the French word for the Indians who lived along the lower reaches of the Washita River in Louisiana in the 1700s. Not surprisingly, there are a bunch of competing versions of what Washita actually meant, so we'll stay out of that rabbit hole. The earliest reference to the Washita Mountains in the available newspaper records dates to 1855, when the discovery of shiny rocks in western Arkansas sparked a miniature gold rush. Now, this rush couldn't hold a candle to the much larger California gold rush half a dozen years earlier, but it did introduce American readers to the Washitas. Still, mentions of the Washita Mountains remained rare until the final decade of the 19th century. And who could blame the writing and reading public for avoiding the term? Unless you've grown up in Arkansas, Oklahoma, or Louisiana, you're going to mispronounce it the first time you encounter it. A word that starts with an O but is pronounced as if it were a W? We don't do that very much in English, and when we do, as in Ouija board, it's weird and off-putting, and we look for someone to tell us how to say it. So Washita was fighting an uphill battle to compete with Ozark. The Washita Mountains didn't get a lot of press again until another overly optimistic gold rush thrust the little range back into the national consciousness in the 1890s. Maybe this flurry of publicity had something to do with the eventual distinction between the Washitas and the Ozarks, but it's more likely it was advancements in geological knowledge. Geologists in Missouri made great strides in understanding the natural history of the Ozarks in the late 1800s, but the divide between the Washitas and the Ozarks isn't in that state. It's mostly an Arkansas thing. In a 1901 report on lead and zinc deposits prepared for the U.S. Geological Survey, geologist George Adams made one of the earliest cases for separating the two regions. The Washitas and Ozarks do, in fact, have separate origin stories and geological distinctions. Within a few years, the Big Ozarks would become the not quite as big Ozarks. And wouldn't you know, it was the government what done went and settled it. Most of us, and I'm including myself here until recently, are blissfully unaware of the existence of a federal agency called the Board on Geographic Names, or at least we were until the Gulf of America saga, which falls under the purview of that board. And this may be the most excitement they've had in ever. The board has been around for a long time, established in 1890 by President Benjamin Harrison. Made up of geographers and geologists, it was assigned the task of resolving any questions over geographic names in the U.S. So you wouldn't have some folks calling it the Arkansas River, for instance, while others think it's the Ozark River. That would have been settled by consensus for a long time before 1890, but you get what I'm talking about. So it was that in early 1907, the same year old Jimmy Driftwood was born, and just a few months before Oklahoma became the 46th state in the Union, the Board on Geographic Names settled the matter of just where and what the Ozarks is. No doubt utilizing the recent study by George Adams and the earlier reports that informed his ideas, the board named it the Ozark Plateau and declared that it was the plateau situated in northwestern Arkansas and southern Missouri. We can ignore for now that the Ozark Plateau actually extends well into northeastern Oklahoma and way over into the northeastern quadrant of Arkansas. As for the rest of the old Big Ozarks, the board labeled it the Ouachita Mountains and declared that it consisted of the ridges of western Arkansas, south of the Arkansas River, as well as those same ridges in Indian Territory and Oklahoma. Yes, there was a territory of Oklahoma and a separate Indian Territory at the same time for a few years. No time to explain, just look it up. As you might imagine, it took a while for this proclamation to take hold. Hot Springs, the southwestern Arkansas spa city where Bill Clinton grew up, continued to be boosted as an Ozarks destination into the 1920s. And I've come across references as late as the 1950s linking the old tourist town with the Ozarks. If you've ever read the writings of folklorist Vance Randolph and Otto Ernest Rayburn, you know both of those gentlemen lumped the Ouachitas into one big Ozarks and continued to do so into the middle of the 20th century. Rayburn even lived in both regions, but as far as he was concerned, he was always in the Ozarks. You still run onto a few people south of the Arkansas River who claim to be from the Ozarks, but that's rare. And their confusion may stem from the federal government's failure to follow its own rules. After all, the decisions of the Board on Geographic Names was supposed to be the final word for all federal agencies. The most obvious breach of the Ozark-Ouachita government-mandated line today is that little section of the Ozark National Forest that lies south of the Arkansas River, in an area that the Board on Geographic Names classified as Ouachita more than a century ago. Less than a year after the board officially divided the Ouachitas from the Ozarks, President Teddy Roosevelt signed a proclamation creating the Arkansas National Forest. 3 months later, another Teddy Roosevelt proclamation founded the Ozark National Forest. The Arkansas National Forest was south of the Arkansas River and would be renamed the Ouachita National Forest in 1930. The Ozark National Forest was north of the river, just as the Board of Geographic Names had instructed. But for some reason, in 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt transferred the Magazine Mountain District from the Ouachita to the Ozark National Forest. And I really don't know the rationale behind that move. Maybe it was because Mount Magazine and its inference are closer to the Ozark National Forest headquarters at Russellville than to the Ouachita National Forest headquarters at Hot Springs. The National Forest Service's official history does not provide an explanation, and it sounds like an intriguing research project for somebody, doesn't it? Let me know if you figure it out. Whatever the motivation, FDR's decision to disregard the ruling handed down by the Board of Geographic Names has for more than 80 years now been a source of confusion for those of us who get distracted by such things. It's always seemed to me that Mount Magazine and that little chain of mountains in the Arkansas River Valley are more their own animal, not really Ouachita or Ozark, and maybe that was the source of confusion. Whatever the story, this podcast is an Ozark one. I might on occasion drop the other O word, for there are many more cultural commonalities than differences between the people of the Ouachitas and Ozarks, But the great bulk of what I'll have to say on the Old Ozarks will be about the people and the landscape between the Arkansas and Missouri rivers, not the Arkansas and Red Rivers. I'll sign off this first episode by thanking the Ozark podcast guys, Kyle and producer Daniel, for providing me the opportunity, encouragement, and platform to do this little show. Thanks for putting out the welcome wagon for a feller who doesn't even hunt, but who shares your passion for a region. So until next time, this is Brooks Blevins out here where the hills ain't high, but the hollers sure are deep. Thanks for listening to the Old Ozarks.
He is great. Well, there you have it.
There you have it.
There you have it.
If you were just Googling Ozarks, where it came from, he's right. You'd come up with people of the bow,
Mm-hmm.
the Osage orange,
Bend in the river.
bend in the river.
Which I've heard all of those, and I never really thought about like where does it actually come from, getting to the truth of it. And I feel like that's a perfect place to start with diving into the history of the Ozarks. Is where does that name come from?
Mhm.
So I'm glad he started there, and man, I'm just excited to see what all he gets into. I know I'm going to learn a ton, and I know you guys are going to learn a bunch too. And I think it's going to be a super fun podcast for us to talk about, banter about, and really so just so you can kind of know what to expect. This we're going to have, obviously we're kind of introing it to you and outroing it to you right now, but we will have this release regularly on Fridays, and we're aiming for 2 a month for the first couple of months
Without our voices.
without
It'll
us.
just be Dr. Blevins' show.
Yes, it will just be him going, and so we're aiming for 2 a month for the first couple of months, and then we're going to have an option where you'll have early access, and it'll change up the rhythm a little bit, but regularly scheduled, Dr. Blevins is going to be coming to you guys with some Ozark history, and I couldn't be more thrilled. I'm excited
Man,
about
I
it.
couldn't either. I can't wait. Y'all follow along. It's going to be great.